So the Zeiss glass has been there to capture humanity's first steps on the moon, and let's say the stuff that Zeiss is today mostly known of, they were pretty much perfected on the Western side.
And I do love the fact that they end up at the frontier of both space races. So that, the Soviet space race, which, if we remember, was ahead, Sputnik, etc. Soviet Union was ahead in the space race, and then it was the Kennedy moonshot that kind of got the US back into it. And Zeiss is part of both of those stories. Welcome to Category Leaders, where we unpack the stories of European companies who have won their category globally. We believe that studying these category-leading companies, telling their stories, and distilling those insights helps us build and invest in better companies for the future. Best in the world, based in Europe. Welcome to Category Leaders. Clarity, observation, truth, measurement, and capability. Whether it's making photos with nearly every camera you have ever used, or creating the chips that power your smartphone, car, and home. This month's category leader is present everywhere and allows you to see everything. That company is Zeiss. Welcome to Category Leaders, the podcast where we unpack the story, playbook, and powers of category leading companies based in Europe, best in the world. I am Colin Brown.
And I'm Marty Wallin, and we are your hosts today during this podcast. So our story begins not in Silicon Valley, but in Jena, Germany, a small university town where science met craftsmanship. Carl Zeiss, a precision instrument maker, opened a workshop in 1846, crafting microscopes by hand. His collaborator Ernst Abbe changed everything. Abbe transformed optics from art into physics, inventing the mathematical laws and the formulas of image formation. Then came the last of our gang of three, Otto Schott, the glass chemist who made those theoretical lenses real.
And it's the glass that's super important as to this. You were just telling me off camera that it's your wine glass collection is shot glass.
Yeah.
Right? They are everywhere.
I mean, lenses. To have a lens, a single lens, I mean, it's an invention that was done something like 3,000 years ago. But what was extraordinary here is that Ernst and Carl Zeiss, together with this special class, they started making optical systems that consist of several lenses, and how they work together. The quality of the glass is one of those design parameters. And if you take a modern optical system, they have different kinds of glasses, different kinds of shapes, but everything really started with these guys who made the revolution. Even if single lenses with all their faults were actually invented 3,000 years ago.
Absolutely. And I think what's remarkable is they created Europe's first science industrial complex. Yeah, long before we kind of, thought about this industrial complex phase. And then they cemented it into this foundation very early on, right? They kind of hard-coded their DNA into this Carl Zeiss kind of foundation that still owns both the companies, the Carl Zeiss company and the Schott company. And really, the purpose of the foundation was quite revolutionary even for its time. It was tie profit to progress, almost become a frontier lab, half research, half development, deliver for society, deliver for your workforce. So, the concept of fair wages, worker welfare, scientific research, and education, this was all embedded into the foundation. This was ESG before ESG was even an act.
Yeah, and of course the story that speaks to me in this whole story is the role of competence, the actual competence, skills, capabilities from early on, rather than just declaring that you're excellent. But my concern is now the following. We are too far ahead of ourselves. We are telling the whole story in 3 minutes, and this story has much more to tell and enough side quests and subplots. So why don't we go a little bit back in history and see where this whole thing started?
Yeah, so let's go back to 1816 Germany in Weimar. And really, this is where Carl Zeiss, who's the first of our protagonists, the oldest of the trio, And he's born. He's the fifth of 12 children. This is a very sad part of life in these days that 6 of his siblings don't make it to adulthood. And his father, Friedrich, is a court wood turner. Now, that isn't necessarily an illustrious profession, but it's his relationship with the Grand Duke that makes a big difference. You know, Friedrich is not a nobleman, but he's working within the court and working with the Duke.
And that's, I mean, when we think of that, the origin of precision, what you deliver is actually rooted to this time, because working for the court means that everything you make has to be perfect. If it ain't perfect, the Duke notices, and he's going to snap more than just your fingers if you fail. And in order to have a sustainable career in those circles, you need to deliver.
Yeah, this is really high stakes manufacturing, right?
Absolutely, it is.
You know, it's not a question of do one thing wrong, lose your job. It's lose your job, lose your home, your entire livelihood, get run out of the village. And again, there's no court of appeal, no tribunals to go for. So Friedrich teaches Carl, and he also teaches the young heir to the throne, so the Duke's son. And when Carl is born, the Duke actually becomes his godfather. This is very unusual, right? Effectively for the Duke, the Grand Duke of this area, to basically be the godfather of really a working class peasant child. Yeah. And so I think this is a really interesting area. Carl is very much born into this world where craftsmanship is currency, craftsmanship is reputation.
Yeah, and it's not only about the technical skills. I mean, of course, in these times, being a skilled craftsman was one of the virtues that a human being can have. But on top of that, it's there's also culture. Goethe and Schiller, they've gone, they passed away at this time, but still their energy, the appreciation of culture was there. So it was not only science, philosopher, but it was very much also art mixed together to form the entire cultural environment where our story is starting.
And Germany's a really interesting place at this time. We're at the tail end of the Enlightenment. You know, it's been about knowledge. Now it's about making. The Industrial Revolution is coming. It's not like Britain. The Industrial Revolution takes place in Germany in different areas. And when we say Germany, there isn't really a Germany at this point. There's different states doing,
of course, not
their particular thing. And this very much feels part of Carl's life. So he leaves grammar school early. He joins a trade school, which again, I think is really interesting. So this is not going into the pure academic sense, but also academics and crafts and drawing all taught together. This is unusual, even at this time.
Yeah. And when you look at old furniture, old machinery, and there, even of course, beauty is in a way subjective. And functionality is beauty as well. But it is clear that in the old times, even if you had engineering products, how they looked like, what was the artistic impression that you are raising with that was important. And Goethe himself believed very much that science and arts were two sides of the same coin. Carl Zeiss himself was literally educated inside this idea.
Absolutely. And by 1834, at the age of 18, he's in Jena. He's apprenticed to Friedrich Korner, who's the Grand Duke's court mechanic, and he's also attending university. So he's kind of had his childhood. He's now moving into that training/workplace.
Yeah, and that's a hybrid education. Mornings in the workshop, learning the crafts, afternoons with professors, and he's studying algebra, physics, mineralogy, optics, building a bridge between the hand and the head.
And then after 4 years, he's released from his apprenticeship. He's got glowing references. He's done a good job. And I think this is a really interesting point in his life. He sets out across Germany, right? He's basically this journeyman kind of mechanic, journeyman craftsman. He doesn't really fit into a trade at this point. Because mechanical engineering, or the development of instruments is not a thing. But basically, he goes and travels around Germany, Stuttgart, Vienna, Berlin, watching manufacturing happening in different places, helping when he can. And he's 22 when he sets off on this journeyman years. and he's 29 when he returns. And I'm sure he's a very different person by the time he comes back because he has a lot of experiences in a lot of different areas.
And of course, this makes him a kind of a pilgrim, a wandering mechanic, a craftsman. And each city that he's visiting or lives in shows a different dialect of precision, which he's then morphing into his own private skill set and philosophy when it comes to building optical systems.
Yeah, and I think it's important to emphasize he's not following a dedicated path. He's not training as an accountant or he's not training as a lawyer. He's not going into the clergy. There's no path in front of him. He's more high agency, so he's having to find his own way. And really, at this point in time, this period of time in the 1830s, early 1840s, Germany is kind of going through its industrial revolution in pockets. It's not like Britain where it was compressed and basically went through almost everywhere all at once. In Germany, it's happening in different places at different times. So he's seeing different things. Some things are working in some areas, some are not. And he's there right at this point in time. Germany isn't one country until 1871. It doesn't unify. So this is very much working across the different states. But by 1845, he's back. He's back in Jena. He's 29. He opens a workshop. He actually needs a residence permit to basically stay in the city. And the easiest way to basically get a residence permit is to basically apply for a university kind of position. He even has to do exams to prove his competence, which he actually thinks is a joke because he just spent the 7 years basically practicing as a mechanic. But over time, he goes through the bureaucracy and effectively gets the residence permit and settles in Jena from the 1940s onwards.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, what he's bringing with this, let's say, vast experience from different schools of thought, different schools of manufacturing, he's actually bringing the classical founder energy, impatient with nonsense and impatient with the status quo. So essentially, he's a born disruptor in a sense when he's combining the skills and traditions from different areas, different cities.
Yes, so we get to the date, the founding of the company. It's 17th of November, 1846. He's 30 years old, and he basically opens his first workshop. He moves around a couple of times, finding different locations, etc., etc. Buys a lathe from Berlin and sells his first microscope.
Yeah, and from that one single room, the whole worldview begins.
Yeah, and again, I think it's important to says, we've talked about all the different things he's done so far. Why microscopes? Like, why is that an important point now? And I think the essential element here is he's not making a gadget. He's actually stepping into a world. He's looking into the future, but he's stepping into a world which is obsessed with what can't be seen.
And so it's a classical. There's a classical customer demand, a new customer demand, and there is a lack of solutions. And then in the 1840s, it meant that Schleiden and Schwann, for example, proposed a cell theory. All life is made of cells. Naturalists and physicians everywhere were desperate to see the building blocks of life for themselves. And in order to see that, you need a microscope. And in addition of having a microscope, how you build it directly has an implication on how good quality visuals you get from the cells. So it's not a question of different colors. It's really the basic functions are different based on who builds them and who is skilled in building the best one available from the marketplace.
And I think that this is a moment in time. Microscopes aren't curiosities. They're really instruments of discovery. This is the frontier, seeing things that we couldn't see before. Hospitals want them, chemists want them, universities want them. It feels like AI today, right? I want the model, I want it yesterday, I want it bigger, I want it to do more. This really is that particular moment. But at the moment, microscopes are unreliable, they are handcrafted, the lenses are one of the design parameters, as you mentioned earlier, and they are whatever you get, whatever I can make it. It's too dark, it's too distorted, it's not working.
Yeah. And Zeiss sees the opportunity not just to make more microscopes, but to make better ones, predictable, measurable, reproducible, manufactured in small series.
And I think it is this perfect storm. Medicine is chasing disease. We're getting to this moment of germ theory understanding. The microscope becomes this symbol of progress. He's 31. He's building an instrument that will make that progress visible. So just to recap on his personal life, and also on his business, by the 1850s, Zeiss employs 5 or 6 people. We're not quite sure. Carl is 34 when he marries for the first time to Bertha. Sadly, she dies a year later in childbirth. Again, causes unknown, but again, this germ theory is a really important part of so much infant mortality at that time. A few years later, he remarries and he's 37 and he raises 4 children at that stage. And I think, this is, we talked about 6 of his siblings didn't make it to adulthood. His wife and first child die in childbirth. These are the times that they're living in. This is ironically why microscopes are so important.
And I mean, the other thing is that when we go through the biographies of successful people, actually pretty often you find that their life was not necessarily very easy. They have hardships, they had their griefs, they had their problems, and the moral of the story is that they were successful not because it was easy. They were successful even if it was hard at times. And when it comes to Carl Zeiss, the emotional ballasts of this story, grief and persistence, when he was burying the loved ones, he was still passionate in perfecting microscopes. And yes, indeed, like you already said, partly due to the fact that he understood that having a clearer view on what happens at the cell level, having a microscope to investigate the root causes of all kinds of issues is a part of a solution. So it was not just a way to forget. It was a way to contribute.
Absolutely. So for his first apprentice, and again, it's that classic, who is the founder? Who are the first hires? Those first employees, they're taking as much risk as the founder, if not more. August Lober, he joins in 1847. 17 years old. He's the first apprentice. He stays for a wonderful 44 years. He does his time in the company as well, rising to head of production. And together they build more instruments, more than instruments. They're building culture. By 1866, when Zeiss is 50, they've made 1,000 microscopes. Yeah. And Zeiss is kind of risen in society. He's the deputy master of weights and measures. Again, weights and measures, I love it. It's the AI thing. He's the court mechanic and he's a city councillor, right? It's taken a while, but he's got a good business underneath him. And he's part of this kind of Jena society.
He's not only a businessman, but he essentially is a dignitary of the city, part of the moral infrastructure of the Jena city and area altogether.
So we spent a lot of time on Carl. Now let's introduce kind of the second protagonist, Abbe. He's 27 when he joins Zeiss. This is in kind of, Zeiss is 50, so there's an age gap. But at this point, Zeiss is already well known across academics and circles, applying instruments to laboratory research institutions. The University of Jena's physics department has been struggling to standardize instruments for research, and Zeiss's microscopes were being used by professors who wanted more and better optical performance. Abbe is one of those professors and a rising physicist and lecturer. And he'd been consulting with Zeiss, kind of basically that kind of back and forth about how to make these things better. And then he formally joins the company 1866. And this is a big difference because at this stage, Zeiss has been doing a good job and Abbe kind of takes that good job from good to kind of great. And, they consolidate a lot of what they've done so far from moving from craft into really developing a system around scientific and industrial demand for precision instruments. You're moving from cottage industry more towards manufacturing. And there is global competition. This is not only happening in this small market town in Germany. So this is the kind of landscape. This is what kind of Abbe brings to the table. He brings mathematics and a physics kind of discipline to the art of lens making.
Yeah, and I mean, actually, he's credited with one great invention. I mean, when you take lenses, depending on the wavelength of the light, it refracts differently in a lens. And Abbe was one of the guys, I mean, there are two guys actually at the same time in a different location, but Abbe was one of the guys who is credited with the invention of achromatic lens. And essentially what he did is that he glued two separate lenses together, and the lenses were designed in such a way that all of a sudden the red light rays and the blue light rays are focusing to the same point. And that was just one of those inventions that Abbe did, and that significantly helped building optical systems where the picture is clear, rather than being smeared by the fact that different wavelengths of light are refracting differently in the lens. And this is changing everything. The importance of mechanical precision in addition to the optical precision was of course understood here very much, and they were separated. Standardized illumination. They started measuring glass like chemists do. And in 1871, Abbe, then 31 years old, designs the first water immersion objective, because once again he realized that, okay, when you take water or you take oil into the optical path, it once again gives you more degrees of freedom designing how the light rays are actually twisting and turning through the optical system. And all of a sudden what we see is that Zeiss microscopes see deeper and clearer than anybody else's. So, I mean, we end up having excellence, not just science for science purpose. We are receiving excellent results that are appreciated by the end user customers.
I think the customer, Abbe is the customer, if that makes sense, right? Yeah, he comes from that customer's perspective. He's a physicist. He's working in labs. He's doing this research, and he's frustrated. And obviously, we could spend a whole podcast talking about get to the customer and understand the customer. And I think it's fascinating that he brings that customer mindset really into the business. The orders pour in. Early customers include the universities, the hospitals, the research institutes across Germany. And again, this then gets scientific journals writing about them, because obviously they're making the breakthroughs, they're being peer reviewed, they're pushing out this way. And Abbe writes to his friend Anton Dorn that the business is booming. The lenses are selling like hotcakes, which we love. And within a decade, they go from hundreds to thousands of microscopes a year. And really, at this point, they are able to move the frontier of science forward.
Yeah. And I mean, if you hear me, and we've talked about these things many, many times, but if you hear me preaching about the customer and listening to the customer, I mean, it was not invented yesterday, and it was definitely not invented by me. Even these gentlemen understood from early on that listening to the customer and solving issues that are bothering the customer and preventing the customer from reaching their objectives, that's the real seed for a true value proposition.
Absolutely. And then we come with Otto Schott. He's 28 years old. So again, he's the youngest of our three protagonists. He writes to Abbe, who's 10 years his senior, in 1879 about a new kind of glass he's invented. At this point, Zeiss is 63. So again, there's the baton is kind of being passed from the mechanical craftsman to the physicist. And now we have the chemist, the third of the trio joins. They test this new type of glass. It's miraculous, it's pure, it's stable, and more importantly, they can manufacture it at scale.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that exactly like the shape of the lens is a critical design parameter when you are having a lens system, several lenses put together, also is the quality of the glass. And I'm not talking about quality as quality alone. It's the characteristic, the refractive index of the different glasses. And when you are able to have in a lens system, you can have an optimal type of glass with the optimal refractive index in this system. It gives you yet more parameters for your lens design and enables you to build better optical systems, in this specific case, better microscopes. And this is so critical, because earlier it was all guesswork. You melted the sand and minerals and hope for something clear. Now it becomes scientific. You are able to produce, and also consistently produce, the kind of quality that your specific lens design, your specific microscope design requires.
Absolutely. And again, I think at this point, we developed this first microscope lens. They formalize a company. So effectively, Schott moves to Jena in 1882. He's now part of the family, as it were. They set it up as a separate business, but effectively with investment from Zeiss and Abbe and land. And now they've built this kind of ecosystem. So they have the mechanics, the theory, the materials all come together. And this is perfect for Schott because effectively he's the son of a glassmaker. That's his background.
Mm-hmm.
He studies chemistry and he becomes obsessed with one question. What if glass could be designed, not simply discovered?
Yeah, and of course, I mean, we are focused on the story of Zeiss, and we are focused on the optical systems. But there are many technical glasses that Schott was able to develop, especially the lithium and borosilicate types. And the latter, for example, is extensively still today used in laboratory equipment. And essentially, he was able to surpass anything that was available before that. And all of a sudden, impossible lenses of Abbe's equations all of a sudden can be made. And that's the moment when the precision gets its body, it gets its life in the hands of these gentlemen.
Absolutely. So again, we've got the three, they've come together, Jena is the place, and really they now set the standard, right? So effectively, this is where the world turns to in terms of the frontier of science, the frontier of competence in the glassmaking industry. But I think what's really interesting is, again, they don't just set the standard for science. They actually also start to think about how their company is structured. And then they start to think about, again, their own personal philosophies and missions and how that can be encoded in a foundation. And pretty early on, this happens.
Yeah. And I mean, of course, when time goes by in the 1890s, Abbe himself is increasingly focusing on the philosophical side of things, and he's instrumental in constructing the Zeiss Foundation. And Schott is, as a younger inventor, is then taking the practical mantle of innovation in the company. He leads the glassworks, expanding it from experimental furnace to a production powerhouse, ensuring that Zeiss's theoretical and social revolutions have a material form. And this is also very forward-looking, that it's not, I mean, like in this entire story we read several times, that you are not only focusing on the technical innovation, your values, what kind of a company you are, the social elements, they are involved all the time at a time when this was not the norm.
Absolutely. And I think it's also quite interesting, like the personal arcs of these three men. You know, each one of them starts off in very much inventor mode, then scales the kind of business side of what they do, craftsmanship, physics, and then chemistry. Then towards their latter years, they become the custodian. They become the, how do we embed this philosophy? What is the return on our investment over time? And then they handle that mantle of innovation back to the younger guy, who then hands it again, each in turn, to the younger guy. So interestingly enough, because obviously, you know, in companies today, founders can be very much of similar age, with similar arcs. Here, these three protagonists have got very different ages. Schott and Abbe are the closest in age, but Zeiss and Schott are a long way apart, at least a couple of generations. And again, I love how each one of them carries the mantle for innovation, and each one of them then carries the mantle around custodianship. But the interesting thing is they do align, right, in terms of their values and their beliefs, and obviously influence each other. They come to a common understanding of this profit in service of progress, and they come into this way of coding this into a foundation between the three of them.
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful story. And even if the three people are, in a way, we could say that they are, I mean, they are not literally co-founders, but I mean, it's like a relay race. You are clearly passing the baton to the next guy, and the company would not be the same without all three of these. So you need this storyline to do what you're doing, and what Zeiss been able to achieve. And when we come to the 1900s, the Schott's innovation in optical and heat-resistant glass are fueling not only microscopy, but the entire modern optics industry. And the bottom is not only past, it's also expanding. The partnership between Abbe and Schott becomes a dialogue between ethics, material, principle, and process. And this is one of the core elements of this story. And it's wonderful to see that people who were born at very different times were really able to share this vision over the years. It's quite unique when we think about the story. It's already spanning several decades, and we can still draw the storyline. It's quite unique and interesting.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I think by the, we're kind of moving around the timeline a little bit just to give people some numbers to help them frame this. By the mid 1880s, when Zeiss is, late 60s, they're employing about 300 people. So this is not a small business. This has grown. We're producing about 10,000 microscopes. These lenses basically set the standard for the industry. And they are very much the center of gravity for glassmaking. Like Schott actually invents modern glass science and reproducible materials. He's not just a one-off. He is building a system and being very much at the forefront of this.
Yeah. And it's at this time the microscopes are everywhere from Berlin to New York. And I think one of the lessons learned from this whole story, it's not about making tools. It's providing the value for your end user customer. And the customer is not interested in the tool itself. They are interested in the capability that the tool brings. And as a result, you can say that Zeiss is not producing microscopes. They are making visibility. They are building vision to helping the customers to see what is normally hidden from naked eye.
Completely. And again, the parallel is not lost to me with this AI world. We all start, a few years ago or 6 months ago, it was all about model this, model that, model the other. And now you can just tell we're not talking about the models as much. We're talking about what can they do? What problem do they solve? How do they make things better? Not on artificial e-valves and basically, mathematics tests that only a few people in the world can do, but can they take stuff from my inbox, turn it into an expense report, file that? Can they do an analysis on a company? So it's not how beautiful the microscope looks, it's what it enables you to do. We've moved into that particular thing. And by the 80s, it's not just microscopes, it's binoculars, it's camera lenses, it's spectrometers, it's telescopes. It's everything that measures or magnifies reality. But unfortunately, we're about to lose our first protagonist quite early on in the podcast. But basically, Zeiss, his health is fading. He basically reaches the end in 1888. He's a loving grandfather to his his children. And basically, that's the end of him. He moves on in this world, but effectively he leaves an amazing legacy and two very engaged business partners behind that kind of take things forward.
Yeah, but even here, I think there's a story to be seen. I mean, the craftsman is surrounded by warmth, family. It tells something about his character. And the thing is that in order to be successful inventor, founder, company leader, there's the human side. It was there in the very beginning. It is still there. So he, rather than forgetting this side of being a human, it is part of the success story is that he is a human being with family values and love to the loved ones. I think that's a lovely story.
Absolutely. And he's laid to rest on the 3rd of December 1888. His 8 loyal employees, those kind of early employees, the ones that followed him into the business, carry his coffin. And the coffin itself has this brass cross on the top, and the brass cross actually has inlays with lenses from his own workshop, right? So they actually put some kind of glass lenses into the cross. And I think it's, again, a good metaphor here. It's the faith and the optics. Everything is fused into one symbol. And, basically he has a great send-off. Oh, the mantle, and it's already passed, but it passes to Ernst Abbe. He becomes the steward. He is now the visionary in the firm. At 50, he takes the reins, not just to preserve the legacy and freeze everything at this point in time, but he establishes within a year of Zeiss's death the foundation and redefines what the company can be.
Yeah, and the foundation is definitely not a memorial or a tomb. It's a manifesto. Abbe writes a legal charter that enshrines workers' rights, reinvesting profits into science, and binds the company to serve both knowledge and community. So we are talking about corporate social responsibility at a very early stage, and Why is this important? The whole company is built on skills and competencies of the individuals. You don't have these craftsmen, these skilled people working for you, motivated, if you're a jerk. You need to be somebody that they can relate to. And it means you have to be a respected member of the community, not only the frugal and brutal businessman.
Absolutely. And again, I'm always reminded of that kind of phrases where people are buying companies and looking at the staff moving in and out of the building, and someone has to remind them, you didn't buy the building. Well, you did, but the company is the people moving up and down the escalators, right? That's where at this point in time the knowledge is in those people's heads. The system is what they have built over this surrounding decades. So with Abbe, he's created a health insurance fund for the Zeiss employees. And over the next 3 decades, he builds a system of rights, pensions for workers and their families, a joint pension statute for Zeiss and Schott, a 9-hour workday in 1890, profit sharing, minimum wages by 1896, and an 8-hour workday by 1900. And again, we think these are all modern inventions. We're in the 1890s here. This is a long time ago, and he's enshrined basically workable principles to get the best out of people over a long period of time, pretty much within a year of Carl Zeiss dying.
Yeah, and I mean, these were not perks that would be given and taken away at the managing director's will. They were legal guarantees. They were codified in the foundation's charter. And he even created employee interest groups with the right to be heard on company issues. I mean, how modern is that? I mean, that's pretty much unheard of in these times. And it's the prototype of modern social market economy.
And they fund professorships. I love this. They're building their ecosystem, right? They fund the professorships. They build reading halls to basically, upskill the local population, because it's the local population that is going to work there. They're democratizing knowledge, and they believe science and culture really belong to everyone. If we were talking about the Enlightenment before, then the Industrial Revolution, again, this is this big push for knowledge. What have we discovered, and how can everyone know about it?
Yeah, and I mean, let's remember the first half of that particular century. It was the time when the Industrial Revolution and all the challenges. I mean, from 1800 to 1850, 1860. I mean, Abbe and all these guys, they saw the problems of industrial cultures. They had enough bad experiences how companies were utilizing the employees in unethical ways. So they wanted to be the one who is different. They wanted to differentiate themselves. And why did they do that? Probably because they felt it was right. But there's probably also the very utilitarian approach. You want to attract the very best people to work for you rather than going to somewhere else. So it's a classic way of differentiating your company in the eyes of your future employees.
Absolutely. And he also, I love this. And again, we think patents is very much today's kind of issue. He rethinks patents. At first, he refuses to file any, which is interesting. But I think it's because he thinks it'll just slow him down. Right? Like, he literally believes knowledge should be free, progress, the curve of innovation should be faster and faster and faster. And it's only when competitors threaten secrecy does he actually file his patents, really to protect the progress and not the profit. And again, I'm going to go back to it. Closed models, open models, innovation, how steep your learning curve is, can you adapt? It's all here.
Yeah, it's all here. And I mean, of course, this is the time when they were inventing all kinds of optical gadgets, instruments, refractometers, oil immersion microscopes, spectrometers, comparators, prism, binoculars. I even have a Zeiss prism binocular myself. And so there were a lot of the technical stuff. But at the same time, there was a very, very deep commitment to tolerance. Jewish colleague Siegfried Zapsky supports academic freedoms and insists that Zeiss employ people without discrimination of religion, politics, or heritage.
Fantastic. And by 1905, we're over 1,300 people. 300 was our last check-in point. Now we're at 1,300. We've just magically added 1,000. They don't lose their moral compass. They create this self-sustaining ecosystem. They create this place of social equity. And I think, Marty, you nailed it. They attract the top talent, right? Because they've set the standard, they've been open to innovation, they've been acceptance of where you come from and what religion you practice. They kind of don't care. What they care about is, are you moving the company forward? Are you moving the frontier of science forward? Is it up and to the right for humanity? That's what they care about.
Yeah, and I mean, you could call him an industrial philosopher. The measuring light, the technical parameters of your equipment, labor, justice, everything will equal precision. So you have to have this broad vision, broad view of what are the success factors of your specific enterprise. And this is a brilliant story.
Absolutely. And I think this is where the system starts to come into gear. They started off making instruments. Now they're building this system, which isn't just the system of manufacturing the technology, but it's also manufacturing the culture around this particular area. But the world isn't standing still. And across Europe and beyond, because Europe still is very much an epicenter of the world at this point, a quiet arms race in optics is unfolding.
Yeah. And it's, of course, I mean, we were talking about Germany now, but of course there is in Britain, there's a lot of activities. R&J Beck, Rosen, Powell and Leland, companies who were supplying Darwin's generation of naturalists. We had France, of course, Chevalier and Nachet, known for artistry and design. In America, Bausch and Lomb was just beginning to industrialize the microscope. But arguably, I think none of these competitors were able to fuse the theory, the practical production like the Jena area altogether had in these times.
Absolutely. And I think, again, in London, the lenses are still ground by intuition. In Paris, it's about beauty as much as precision. Germany's advantage is their integration. The way Zeiss and Abbe and then Schott pulled the universities, pulled the factories into this ecosystem, this fusion of academia and industry. This becomes the German model. Precision and a system rather than craftsmanship.
Yeah, and it was not only, of course, not only in optics, but we have Siemens in electricity, Bayer in chemistry, Zeiss in optics clearly, but the whole what we know of Germany, the precision, accuracy, and ability to produce very, very fine mechanical devices. That's what we know. This is the time when all this started. The whole made in Germany, rather than being an insult, was became the synonym for made to exact standards.
Yeah, and when we say that Zeiss is a category leader, we don't just mean in sales of microscopes at this point. We do mean in the method that they've created. Jena industrialized sight itself, and the rest of the world followed and tried to play catch up. But Zeiss sets the standard, and they set very much the rules of the game. And by the late 19th century, the competition between Britain and Germany in optics and glass has basically become the national rivalry. And it's very much at this stage, British heritage. It's a contest between craft tradition and scientific industry. And unfortunately, I know how this is going to play out.
Yeah, well, but it's also, we are focusing on Zeiss here, but they are not, of course, they are not the only player. There's in the city of Wetzlar we have Leitz, which is turning to be a very important. Goertz and Voigtländer in cameras, Steinhell in Munich with lenses. So they all measure themselves against the Zeiss standard of calculated and measured optics.
And in Britain, glassmaking's there. They had deep roots. We had the crown jewel is Chance Brothers in Birmingham. And they're famous for their lighthouse lenses and their cathedral windows. And then we also have Pilkington in St. Helens, which dominates the flat glass approach. But again, Britain's approach remains artisanal, and it's very dependent on these family firms. Whereas Germany, they're building an empire of laboratories. Right. And I think we've kind of underlined this point enough. It's about not, in Schott's laboratory, it's melting glass to mathematical specification. rather than anything else. And then again in the UK, we managed to shoot ourselves in the foot with our own particular Windows tax, Marty.
Yeah, well, good for you. I mean, a great example of how well-intended political decisions sometimes result into something totally unexpected. And of course, this is in the 17th century and all the way to the 19th. There was a tax in UK for homeowners by the number of windows they had, just to discourage use of glass, production of glass, and that was considered to be a luxury item rather than being an industrial material. When the tax was finally repealed after a couple of 100 years, the damage was done, and Germany had already raced ahead without giving any chance for the Brits to catch up.
And again, I think it's an excellent example of self-sabotage. You know, you go round British country homes, as I did as a child, and you see all these bricked up windows in these very old houses, and you're like, why is the window bricked up? And it's like, because if we bricked up the window, removed the glass, we paid less tax. But if you brick up the windows and you need less glass, you don't have a glass industry. You don't have a capability. You don't lead the world. You start basically just treating this material as a commodity. And if you do that, you lose the edge.
Yeah. And that's so crazy when you think about that. But we are now approaching the First World War, and we are witnessing this dynamic that Britain is actually very much ruling the seas, and Germany is ruling the light. Royal Navy, even due to the reasons that you just mentioned, needs to get lenses that are absolutely necessary in seafaring. They need to get their lenses through Jena.
And it's hilarious that effectively, and there were lots of accounts written in World War One, particularly of naval officers looking out from their battleship across the sea, utilizing, Zeiss glass binoculars, at a German naval officer looking at the British ship across the sea, utilizing Zeiss naval binoculars. And this dependence becomes a national vulnerability. When war breaks out in 1914, Britain scrambles. Right. And the newspapers call this a glass famine. The king and the queen have to donate their opera glasses because effectively we just don't have enough binoculars. We don't have enough sniper rifles. We just don't have anything. Because surprisingly enough, at this point, Germany kind of turns off the tap and there is none of this coming to the UK or its allies.
Yeah. And of course, I mean, this rivalry over glass becomes a metaphor for the age itself, industrial, imperial, and intellectual. Britain still builds the ships, but Germany builds the instruments that navigate them. If you have spent any time at the sea, you understand how critically important good optics are for the safe navigation of your navy, even for your private boats and vessels.
Absolutely. And again, this battle for vision, if people remember World War One, they think very much about those trenches in France where people are kind of looking through telescopes into this no man's land type perspective, trying to understand when they should attack, when they shouldn't attack. Do think also about those big naval battles kind of in the North Sea with two fleets looking at each other, trying to position themselves, trying to understand how the range and the optics enable them to get that advantage.
Now, in the meantime, of course, it was not easy in Germany because they are facing shortages of raw materials. They were getting a lot of the sand from France, and it's all of a sudden it's gone due to the war. Chemical substitutes were developed, but quality suffers. So what we are actually were witnessing at that time were supply chain crisis. And of course, I mean, it was today we are very much worried about silicon in microchips, but we were talking about silicon and other sands when it comes to the optical systems. So even that kind of dynamic is repeating itself.
It's so funny, isn't it? We talked AI earlier, now we're talking chips now. It's this single point of failure in the world. Everybody needs the same thing all at once. It's all fine until we go to war, and then clearly it's not fine anymore. And again, it's the capability, it's TSMC today, but it's the capability that the kind of Zeiss Schott kind of triumvirate created. And it's this infrastructure that the world suddenly wakes up and realize its needs.
Yeah. And of course, what's interesting is that that the war and the situation that was created because of the war, there was a lot of desperation for the supply chains, and then it's the moment to innovate. So Britain eventually is able to found the ground optical glass works in 1915. They reverse engineered the Schott's process. In the United States, Bausch and Lomb steps up, creating America's first real optical glass industry, and the industry is catching up. And once it's been catching up during the wartime, it's amazing what can happen in only a few years of the war when the necessity is there and you put your mind to it.
Absolutely. And there's another twist, right? Even in the midst of this total war, trade didn't stop entirely. We end up with this hilarious situation where rubber and optics cross the borders through neutral countries, Switzerland, the Netherlands, because we have this hilarious optics and rubber exchange of 1915. How did that go?
Yeah, and I mean it's funny, and this goes back to our earlier episode with Bailey Gifford when we were talking about rubber and its significance at this time. Britain had the words rubber, and Germany had its lenses. Each side trading the very materials they were supposed to deny. I mean, in the middle of this entire chaos, there's a quiet handshake, and stuff is moving to the needy hands.
Yeah, I just love this. It's the fact that we're at war with each other, but you need rubber for your tires and your hoses and to keep your vehicles moving. And we need glasses for our optics and everything else. And the communication is hilarious because basically the German side says, we will supply you with XYZ. And if you want to check the quality of these goods, the quality of these goods, then I would suggest that you look at the captured materials from the German officers that you have at your disposal. I just love that. It's like, if you want to check the quality of my supply, please look at the stuff that's already in your own hands. And again, there is a trade. The stuff goes back and forth. The volumes are never truly declared. But I think also it's a short-term measure. Germany needs the rubber and it needs it now. And then they develop other chemical processes. Britain needs the glass, but by the time the trade doesn't go big at this stage, simply because Britain's glass program and the Allied glass program kicks into gear and provides the shortage. Germany also finds its way around the problem as much. But I do love the fact, even in war, you will still get trade. And I think that's hilarious.
And how much is it different today? I don't think it is that much different. No. So we are kind of repeating our history. But kind of getting back to Zeiss and Schott, it's worth remembering that they are not idle during the war. Their factories were definitely pulled into the military service, producing rangefinders, gun sights, and periscopes for the German army. But the Carl Zeiss Foundation's principles still guided them. Abbe's rules on wages, worker safety, research integrity stayed in place even under wartime mobilization.
And I think this is really interesting because, sadly, it's not a spoiler. Everybody knows World War II comes up in a bit. How they survive World War One and how they kind of get through World War II, it's different, right? In World War One, the foundation guides them and supports them. And in World War II, a little bit of foreshadowing, they get consumed by the kind of Third Reich. It's a different set of relationships that they have to manage. And again, I think, the First World War kind of does it make a massive difference to Zeiss and Schott at this stage? It's not like a scaling function. They've already hit scale. The people already know their stuff exists. Ironically, it's better for their competitors than it is for them, right? Because effectively the world wakes up to what they've discovered and accelerates their thing. So when they come out of World War One, actually they're pretty much on par with their competitors. Whereas when they went into World War One, they were very much in the lead.
And I mean, the other thing which is, of course, happening is that Germany was defeated. And then when we get to the Treaty of Versailles, the terms and conditions were not easy. And it means that the parts of the optical industry have to be dismantled. The Allied nations, especially Britain and the United States, kept their factories they'd built during the war. And Germany's monopoly in this field pretty much was obliterated. That's really, I mean, you could even say that the American and British industry were using the peace treaty as a way of dampening the future of their competitor. I don't know if that was on the table, but I mean, it looks like when we see this 100 years later that this was clearly also a competitive move from the allied industries.
I think it very much is, right? That we've woken up to the fact that TSMC, put it in modern parlance, we've woken up to the fact that we do not have the capability to produce this really important thing at scale. There has been a war, there's a winner and a losing side, and we're definitely going to redress the balance, right? I'm not saying that the TSMC, but we're moving that fab to Arizona. Yeah, we're building that capability somewhere else, and we're going to make sure it's really, really hard for you to to build going forward. So, after the Great War, which again, great because it was only supposed to happen once, which is a bit sad. Sadly, Abbe has gone. He dies just before the war in 1905, and again, it's the mantle is handed to Schott. We're still on the third of our protagonists, and it's him that basically has to act as a stabilizer. Because life post World War One, as Germany goes into then what's known as the Weimar Republic with hyperinflation and political upheaval, he's just got to keep the company together, or the companies together, because it's pretty chaotic despite their foundation heritage.
And I mean, at this point, Otto Schott is now in his 70s, still advises, but of course, a lot of the daily innovation is driven by the next generation of scientists and other people, and still working under the foundation system. So they kept working even when Germany's economy collapses in 1923, and the foundation is paying the wages in food, not money. So in a way, with all this chaos and all this instability, they were able to maintain at least some of the principles that were set by the previous generations.
Yeah, and again, the management evolves, as we move beyond this founding kind of trio, as it were. And by the 90s, Zeiss, again, it has 5,000 employees. They've actually continued to scale the business despite this, huge event that's happened to them and the competitive kind of catch up of the rest of the world. And again, I think that the foundation's critical to this, and it's super interesting when we look at other European companies that have scaled, IKEA and others. There's an interesting parallel here that there's a layer of stability inside the business that something like a foundation or Novus Nordisk in Denmark, this long-term ownership and foundation that helps them through these particular times of difficulty.
Yeah, and of course the world is changing. The microscope market slows, and Zeiss pivots to cameras, rangefinders, and projection systems. Why this is critical when we think about the microscopes? They are, of course, very much specialist scientific instruments. When you come to photography, you are starting to reach out to totally new clientele that is much more sensitive to the price of the product. So there was a merger with that created the Zeiss Icon, headquartered in Dresden, and then that was the really key pivot to bring the precision optics into consumer photography.
And the foundation keeps doing what it's doing. As I said, they reinvest the profits into science and education. And the 1920s, I've just actually read the book 1929, which talks about the huge stock market swings and the crash and the depression, etc. Zeiss keeps doing what it can do. It funds university research in optics, physics, and chemistry. It stays very much in its science lane, even as its products are starting to reach more and more consumers.
Yeah. Then we get to the point when our third protagonist, Otto Schott, dies in 1935, at the age of 84. And he was able to still see how the glass became a strategic element again, used in medicine, engineering, and even in the film industry. So his death clearly closes one area, but the foundation structure ensures continuity. And Jena remains a scientific enclave, a city built on transparency in every sense.
And they're going to need that because it's going to get dark again. So in the 1930s, It gets bad. Germany's politics darken, hyperinflation, racial tension, the rise of Hitler and the Third Reich, etc., etc. And even Zeiss, even this amazing foundation that we're very excited to cover, they struggle because effectively this is too important for the Nazis to leave it alone. And by the eve of World War II, they are basically consumed and back in the military game again. So it's all about bomb sights, rangefinders, aerial cameras. This is Germany getting ready for war, and they are part of the war machine.
Yeah, and if there's a story to translate to today, when we talk about the warfighting capability of a nation, your scientific, your technological, and your industrial capabilities are in the core of it. It's not something that is just part of a supply chain somewhere. It is a core warfighting capability that a nation has, and I think there's a strong message when we think about today and our defense industrial bases in Europe, for instance. That's clearly very, very important, and we see that bomb sites for the Luftwaffe aircraft, rangefinders for U-boats, periscopes, reconnaissance cameras. Everything is dependent on these industrial and technological capabilities, and of course, this is pretty much unavoidable when your nation is at war. Many things change.
Yeah, and again, it changes. They start to use forced labor. It's a travesty of what they built before. But they also make huge progress on specialized optical and heat-resistant materials used in military technology. So the social side of the foundation has gone, but the research, ironically, as we've just said, accelerates in wartime.
And of course, everybody knows how critical city Jena is. And by 1944, the Allied bombers are targeting Jena and the factories there. And the factories are hit repeatedly. And when eventually the American troops reach to the city and seize the Zeiss works, the Allies know exactly how valuable those furnaces, those mathematical formulas are. Within weeks, the Americans evacuate 41 key glassmakers and scientists, including Erich Schott, who is the son of Otto, to the west.
And again, the reason they're evacuating, it's not too hard to work out. That part of Germany is going east.
Here.
This is the Soviet Union. This is our bit. This is your bit. And if it's in our bit, it's ours. So when the Soviet Unions arrive, they find half-empty labs, stripped equipment. The Americans have basically packaged it all up and trucked it out of here. And again, the Zeiss brand becomes this Cold War prize. This is hilarious. I didn't realize this until we did the research. You have two companies with the same name, one in East Germany, one in West Germany. Eric builds a new factory in West Germany, and from there he turns Schott into a global company again. Suddenly they can trade, right? They're not the bad guys anymore. They're out of the hyperinflation bubble. The Nazis have gone, etc., Nuremberg trials. They develop new products like television glass. They start expanding on new continents. But again, actually, this is good for East Germany too. In Jena, the Zeiss becomes a socialist showcase. It's a flagship for enterprise for East German states. They're producing microscopes, binoculars, and military optics for the Eastern Bloc. Actually, you split the company in half, and actually both halves do well.
Yeah, here. And that's one of the strangest legacies of the Second World War. How can you essentially, it's like splitting cells. You can all of a sudden create two creatures by splitting one into half, and they can start living their own prosperous lives. And it also took me quite some time to understand what is the difference between Zeiss and Zeiss Jena. But definitely during the Cold War, that's how it was. And it's amazing how the heritage, some of those fundamental values of precision and science and technology, they were so deeply rooted into the entire organization that some of those values were maintained even if the company was split in two. So it was part of a culture rather than something that is dictated by the managing director in a weekly meeting.
And actually, it's quite funny that, again, the two Zeisses, Zeiss plural, they end up in this corporate war. They're in fact, they're responsible for the longest running German lawsuit in Germany's kind of history from kind of 1940s to kind of late 1980s. So they battle in the courts because trademarks, patents, like who owns them? Is it the guys who got airlifted to West Germany? Is it the people who stayed in East Germany? Who is the true Zeiss? Who is the true heir? So they go back and forth on this. Both companies using the same brand, same name, etc. And again, the markets are not, they're not necessarily competing. East German Zeiss is selling to the Warsaw Pact companies in China. West German Zeiss is very much dominating Europe, America, and Japan.
Yeah. But there is, of course, rivalry, because especially when it comes to the military and defense and space capabilities, they were compared to each other all the time. So the fact that the eastern side is able to produce stuff for the high-performance telescopes or the Soviet space program, and the Oberkochen side building stuff for the West, I mean, there's clearly a rivalry. But what is interesting for our storyline going forward is that the western side of Zeiss is in addition to the stuff that we've talked so far, is focusing on the semiconductors. So the story of semiconductor capabilities and using the optical system to build these very densely packed semiconductor devices, that really starts in this area. And in a way, they are partly diverting to different focuses. And the Western side is definitely making a very successful pivot when we see it from today's perspective.
Again, I think there's a poetic bit of irony here. Remember that this firm was born in a divided Germany, right? It wasn't born in Germany. It was born in a particular state in Germany. Germany unites and the firm does well. But actually, it's in Germany's division into West and East portions that actually the firm does way better. And that's the funny thing, is that they actually accelerate during this period as two separate companies. And actually, they've not just survived the fascism. Well, they survived World War One, they survived World War Two. But actually, it's the Cold War, the non-hot war, which is actually where they accelerate the most.
Yeah. And by the 60s, the Western side has become synonymous with the Western precision. What is interesting is, of course, Hasselblad, the Swedish camera manufacturer, who was using Zeiss optics. It was on board the Apollo missions. So the Zeiss glass has been there to capture humanity's first steps on the moon, and let's say the stuff that Zeiss is today mostly known of, they were pretty much perfected on the Western side.
And I do love the fact that they end up at the frontier of both space races. So that, the Soviet space race, which, if we remember, was ahead, Sputnik, etc. Soviet Union was ahead in the space race, and then it was the Kennedy moonshot that kind of got the US back into it. And Zeiss is part of both of those stories in terms of supplying that capability to both sides in the Cold War. So by the mid-1970s, Zeiss West employs about 20,000 people worldwide, and its revenues are exceeding about 2 billion Deutsche Marks. And it's very much driven by microscopes, camera lenses, and semiconductors, which is going to become a bigger part of the story as we go forward.
Yeah. And in the meantime, in the eastern side, Carl Zeiss Jena is one of the largest and most prestigious enterprises in the German Democratic Republic. The form is a combinat, which means a cluster of integrated factories and research institutes employing nearly 70,000 workers by the late 1980s. And the annual revenues hovered around 7 billion East German marks. Conversion is tricky because it was not a freely convertible currency in those days.
Yeah, and it's difficult to compare between the two. They're operating under very different circumstances. One's free market, one's planned economy, currency concerns, etc. But I think the most important thing, both are doing well. They're both innovating and very completely different incentives and regimes.
Yeah, but anyway, if we think of our protagonists, the Abbe Foundation, that was established by him, both sides have claimed that they are the ones who have continued the tradition, and the Carl Zeiss Stiftung, the foundation, continues to govern the company on the western side in Oberkochen, reinvesting profits into research and education across West Germany. And in Jena, the Zeiss name becomes part of a socialist pride, symbolizing East Germany's ability to compete with Western technology. I mean, this is really a funny story.
And I love the stories of this time, and it came through in the research that effectively even though they're in this longest running lawsuit in German history, blah, 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 actually, when they're in conferences, they often share the same table. When they're at the scientific bodies, when the doors are closed, they are collaborating. Yeah, the engineers on both sides and again, they're in the same country. They're still in Germany. They're still speaking the same language. They're just dragged apart by this, communism versus capitalism, political divide. And actually, they can quietly work together on that side. And then I think it's 1989. The Berlin Wall falls. The two Zeisses, and I think this is almost my favorite bit in the story is they come back together. Right, like, don't get me wrong, it's not easy. There's a lot of bad blood, etc., etc. But the fact that they effectively come back together as a single entity within a few years of Germany reuniting, I think is amazing. I think that's transformational.
Yeah, it is. And of course, the whole unification of Germany was not easy, but it was clearly a job that had to be done. And Zeiss in itself was doing that thing. And eventually they were pretty successful in taking the good parts of both sides and becoming a leaner, global and ready for the digital age company. So coming from Weimar period wood turner to a world leader in precision optics, in a way, our story has come a full circle now.
And obviously, there is job losses. Thousands of jobs were restructured or lost. But what they do is they can, because of the foundation, because of the methodology and the system that they've built, they come back together and preserve this kind of the pursuit of the scientific method type approach. They reunify again in the foundation structure, which I think is, again, wonderful that they're able to do that. They modernize their operations, basically almost reconfirm their vows in marriage terms. They kind of reaffirm that profits must serve science and social welfare. And that sets them up into this mid-90s opportunity.
Yeah. And at this point, Zeiss employs around 20,000 people worldwide. The annual revenues are almost 4.5 billion Deutsche Marks, and the focus shifts to high-tech markets, semiconductors, medical devices, and metrology, and which means they are not only just making lenses, they are shaping the digital infrastructure of vision itself. However, maintaining presence in the consumer market as well, still producing camera lenses, even still today. So they are not abandoning, even if they are conquering totally new marketplaces.
Yeah, and again, we've said Zeiss really as a kind of shortcut for Zeiss and Schott, but effectively, Schott is still there. It reunifies it effectively because it got split too. It diversifies into fiber optics. That's pretty helpful in the 90s because the internet is coming. They're still in specialty glasses for electronics and solar. Oh my goodness, so much of what we have now is built at this point in time. And they very much anchor these huge trends in terms of the internet and the rise of solar with their materials, with their approaches.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, when this merger took place, it was under the Carl Zeiss Foundation again, and the son of our third protagonist, Erich Schott, he died in 1989 just because he would see this, but it's still going to the modern age. The company is doing very well, and under the new leadership, is able to create success that was actually not even imagined. And when we come to the new millennium, that is this millennium, it's 20,000 people and annual revenues near 3 billion euro. But once again, very rapidly changing landscape. Asian electronics firms, digital cameras replacing film, and the rise of semiconductor manufacturing as the new frontier of optics.
Yeah, and again, it's not like the 2000s. We get through to 1989, we unify, we lay a bunch of fiber optic cables up and to the right, and a bunch of solar panels. Zeiss/Schott, we have a new landscape to navigate. And in 2002, Dr. Dieter Kurz becomes CEO, and actively steers the company towards semiconductors and medical technology. And he's really focused on industrial metrology, where optical precision is irreplaceable. By 2010, so we're getting very close to today's dates, Zeiss Semiconductors division is co-developing these UV lithography systems with ASML, the very important Dutch company. And these are the machines that print the most advanced chips, these 3 nanometer chips, etc., that we talk about in the world. And Zeiss, they're in your smartphone's camera, but they're also in arguably the most expensive, most complicated machines on the planet.
Yeah, and the other thing which is also, of course, interesting and important to remember, that this is not something that Zeiss invented from scratch. I mean, we have similar companies in China. We had the Japanese Nikon or Nikon, whichever way pronunciation you prefer, was very much in this marketplace. I mean, out of all those camera manufacturers who were essentially copying or further developing the optical designs of Zeiss in the 60s, in the 70s, they were also, Nikon as such was very, very active in the semiconductor scene. But what Zeiss together with ASML did is that they just became better. So, I mean, this is not a lonely path. This is a very, very competitive and of course for Zeiss a massive pivot, because we don't have many companies like this in Europe. Zeiss is one of those very, very few European firms sitting at the heart of global tech. And the optics are not only for the scientists, they are definitely the eyes of the digital economy, the foundational building blocks of the whole digital economy. And 2015, the revenues go beyond 5 billion euro, and Zeiss is divided into 4 global business groups: semiconductor manufacturing technology, industrial quality and research, medical technology, and consumer markets.
Again, I love the fact that they are everywhere. They're in every camera phone, but they also are going to this insane level in terms of going down to stuff that we can't see, the smallest of the small. And again, Schott's doing well as well. By 2020, Schott's revenues exceed 2. And it's glass, it's in the satellites up in the sky, and it's in the deep sea scientific elements. We still have this overarching foundation that's still keeping us true to the mission, scientific frontier, etc., etc. And again, please, listeners, you've seen the Zeiss story is definitely not up and to the right. Right? It's not, they've had to navigate, German unification, World War One, World War Two, being split in half, being broken apart, scaling in different industries, getting into different sectors. This has been a continuous evolution, not revolution, of a particular company. And then when we get to 2020, how big are they today?
I mean, they are 40,000 employees and 10 billion in revenues. And if we think of the earlier product lines, I don't think that this growth, I mean, just the growth during the last 10 years would have been possible unless they had been very successful in pivoting into these new high-tech fields. Because, for example, I mean, the semiconductor manufacturing systems that are produced by ASML, they are not cheap. And the unit price is way, way different than any other optical gadgets, devices, or instruments they ever built. So the current size of the company is actually very much dependent on the latest pivots that they've been successfully adopting.
Now, we kind of slightly, for those listeners listening closely, we kind of skipped over the camera part of Zeiss's story because we were trying to keep this kind of narrative around the foundation and the different wars. But actually, cameras is a big part of their story. So if we just kind of wind back a little bit on the clock, Zeiss kind of also came of it. We talked about microscopes, but then in the early, they played a very heavy role in the development of photography as we know it.
Yeah. And they definitely did not invent photography, but they gave it precision. Earlier during this podcast, we were talking about having the blue and red light rays focusing on the same point. The let's say the family names of Zeiss lenses, like in the 1902 when the Zeiss Tessar line was developed. The Tessar and like the other names that they gave are representing a specific optical construction. And for example, Tessar is 4 elements in 2 groups. Essentially, the 2 groups where 2 lenses in both groups are glued together. And the result was a lens that was small enough to fit in your hand, but sharp enough to cut through time. Tessar designs are still used today, and more than 350,000 Tesla units were produced before 1939, which is one of the most successful optical designs ever made.
And again, I think it's fascinating that these lenses, they become the heart of portable photography. Kodak licenses it through Bausch and Lomb, and they act as Zeiss's American arm. And between 1908 and 1945, over 10 million Kodak cameras, which all basically have optics derived from Zeiss patents, the patents that Abbe didn't want to file, remember? And this partnership between Bausch and Lomb, Zeiss, and Kodak, this turns precision optics into a household commodity. Photography goes from being a professional, man with a little hood standing there taking the photo into something that everybody can do.
Yeah, and this is so critical. Kodak, of course, worthy of a story in itself. They built the infrastructure, they control the film, the processing, the shops. I mean, my very first camera that I got from my godmother was actually a Kodak camera.
Yep,
same. It's a very, very simple thing, and probably had a Zeiss designed lens in itself. And they essentially, what was critical of that thing is that you have the entire value chain. Because, I mean, a consumer doesn't want a camera in itself. Consumer wants pictures. So thanks to Kodak and their industrial approach, you had the entire value chain, so that by buying the tool, you were able to have photographs in your hand, which was, of course, the key of everything.
Yeah, it was all about basic. Again, we're going back to our customer mantra. Get on our customer hobby. The customer wants to take memories, right? They want to remember the event that is passing in front of their eyes. Photography is a way of doing that. Very few people care about the actual camera. Some do. But the majority of consumer, they value the image that is captured. They value the memory that's created. And Zeiss's contact cameras, they were initially at the high end. And, in the 1930s, it was the equivalent of 3 months' wages for a skilled worker. Meanwhile, Kodak's Brownie camera, they were selling that for $1, which is like, yeah, okay, this is where you're not going to win the market if you're at 3 months and they're at $1. But the Retina line, launched in 1934, sat in the middle, offered some affordable precision, and these cameras sold hundreds and thousands of units annually between the 1930s and the 1940s, enabling Zeiss to play both a role in terms of powering Kodak through its patents and its technology, but also a role in actually selling camera units itself.
And of course, I mean, the Kodak being an American company, they were collaborating with Bausch and Lomb in those days, but through that, then eventually pivoted to Zeiss due to the fact that the quality, the formulas for the glass, for the lenses that Zeiss had, it was just great quality. But important to really notify the transatlantic flow of knowledge that we had happening here during those specific years when we also had the Second World War.
Yeah, and again, we kind of foreshadowed it earlier. At the Treaty of Versailles, they made those German patents public. What a shame in this respect. So the American firms could suddenly copy Zeiss. If they hadn't caught up, they did now. Yeah. And again, I think that's, we kind of mentioned it briefly, but it was in writing. The Treaty of Versailles was kind of a bit of a takeover in terms of the competitive landscape.
Yeah, well, it's a funny story, but it only shows how wars are disrupting the stable societies in more ways than one. And before we get to the semiconductor side of the story, it's still the photography side of business is still going more. I mean, when we go to the 60s and onwards. Is there something you want to say about that?
No, I think again, I think, Zeiss does a good job in it's Kodak that doesn't make the jump. Yeah. Unfortunately, it's Kodak that, we all know this, Kodak invents the digital camera, and they could have so easily disrupted themselves. It's, if people want the dates, in 1975, it's a young Kodak engineer called Stephen Sassoon who builds the first digital cameras. It's 8 pounds, 0.01 megapixels, compare that to today's standards, and it took 23 seconds per image. Kodak files the patent, but doesn't commercialize it because they think it will eat their film business, right? And at that point in time, their film business in 1980s is worth about 10 billion annually. And unfortunately, that lack of pushing the frontier and defending what you have costs them dearly.
Oh, yes. And this is of course so unfortunate. It's really well, let's not focus on Kodak's because it's really worthy of a full story in itself. But what's interesting here is that when Kodak was not the one to take the lead, we had Nikon, Canon, and a totally new player, Sony, that came to the play, and Zeiss started collaborating with Sony. And of course, we know today that of all these interchangeable lens cameras, Sony has become a major player. And eventually in 2001, the Sony came up with a 5 megapixel sensor with a Zeiss variosonar lens, and on the very first year they sell 400,000 units, which is quite unbelievable.
Absolutely, and we end up with this partnership, and it becomes this cornerstone of digital imaging. Zeiss provides the optical purity, Sony provides the sensors. And I think this is a lovely evolution of Zeiss. I think cameras are more understandable than other parts of their business. So it kind of makes sense for people. It's the sensor and the optics combined, giving you a much better value proposition. And by the mid-2000s, Zeiss is supplying lenses for Sony and everybody else. And their collaboration redefines image quality. And they really are, again, at the frontier of, the portable camera is dead, the smartphone rises, 2007 iPhone and beyond. Zeiss is right there.
Yeah, and what happens to Kodak? And I mean, first of all, it's important to say that Kodak films were excellent. They still are, but between 2000 and 2010, in only 10 years of time, the market cap of Kodak falls from $30 billion to under $1 billion. I mean, horrible downslide. And Zeiss, on the other hand, grows its precision optics and industrial divisions by 40%. Once again, thanks to the diversification into semiconductors and medical systems in particular.
Yeah, and I think that's the bridge. I think that the cameras are still part of Zeiss's story, but it's semiconductors that are now driving a large proportion of the value in this company. And again, I think if the 20th century was about capturing the light, capturing the memories, then the 21st century, this is about controlling it. This is about the chips carved by photons, steered by mirrors that Zeiss makes in machines that very few people can understand, let alone afford a 200 million type price tag.
Yeah, but there's and then we can pivot to other elements of our story. But it's worth noting that today, when you have computers and you can analyze using the computers, you can analyze ever more complex optical systems. I mean, you can have lenses in a camera that has 25 different lens elements combined in various ways. The quality of lenses that are designed today and produced today, it can be outstanding from the point of view of evenness or lighting, the various aberrations, correction of various aberrations. But it is worth noting that some of these classical designs where Zeiss has been instrumental in building, actually there are many modern photographers who are looking for that look. So in a way, pivoting back to the story, to the beginning of our story, that it's the combination of art and science. Perfection is not necessarily always the most desirable outcome of your photography. It's the emotions that are raised by your photography. In a way, some of these timeless designs that Zeiss was instrumental in making, they still hold their value and are still appreciated by many people. Having said that, when we get to the semiconductor story, perfection is definitely a key success factor in that.
Absolutely. And I think with semiconductors, we still have to go a little bit back in time, because Zeiss is partnership with ASML that we mentioned earlier. So we should introduce ASML properly. So basically, ASML comes out of Philips, the Dutch kind of industrial giant. And the reason they spin in 1984, they spin ASML out from Philips, mainly, and we'll look at this at another time, because they don't think it'll work and because they think it's too high risk. So anyway, so right from day one, and it's Zeiss West or Zeiss West Germany, who actually joins this new company, ASML, this startup spin out, as its optical partner. And this collaboration is kind of signed in 1986, so it's going back a long time now. And again, it's one of these rare industrial marriages where actually it's worked long term for both companies. Zeiss lithography lenses are now used in about 70% of global chip productions. And obviously Moore's law, etc., the circuits shrink from 800 nanometers to 180, then 90, then 45. And each lens contains more than 40 glass elements, weighs 200 kilograms, costs 2 to 4 million for a lens. You know, this is not smartphone optics and smartphone prices. And I think this is really interesting that, again, their ASML partnership goes back so far, mid-1980s. They're in the fledgling semiconductor space.
Yeah. And if we think of the 1990s, when the two Zeisses were finally merged again, the deep optics in Oberkochens industrial might were really the key of building this, but the eastern part was also bringing elements to the capability that is needed there. And this reminds me of an old saying that when you talk about optical systems, there are three characteristics: small, cheap, and high quality. You can get any two, but you don't get all three at the same time. And it's really when you get to the point that you can pay 2 to 4 million for a lens, then you can achieve miraculous things thanks to the computer design. And then, of course, the fact that you are today able to form the lenses. I mean, you are, rather than using spherical lenses, you can use aspherical lenses in the system, and you can even have free form for the individual lenses based on the needs of the optical design.
Absolutely. And then comes the moonshot, UV lithography. We've mentioned it briefly earlier. This starts in the 1990s, and Zeiss and ASML chase light at 13.5 nanometers, which is too short to pass through air or glass. Zeiss builds mirrors, and these are polished to a 0.25 nanometers of flatness. And again, some of these kind of, crazy kind of, if you made this mirror at the size of Germany, then the highest kind of point on this mirror, the little bump on this mirror, would be like 1 millimeter in kind of height. These are crazily accurate systems. So that it's 1,000th the width of a DNA strand is 0.25 nanometers. And it's just, this is taking expertise to a completely different level.
Yeah. And I mean, what's remarkable in this story is that just to be able to operate as a human being, as an operator, as a quality inspector in a manufacturing process like this, it's not something that you can put just anybody there to the production line. You need to have dedicated people who are investing their time, effort, and motivation to become the best of their trade. And that's really, once again, what is needed here. And when we get to today, I mean, 2 decades and 9 billion later, ASML TwinScan NXC series debuts, and the system, priced above 200 million apiece, are built with Zeiss optics in the core. And if we think about the modern semiconductor circuits, every advanced chip from TSMC's AI processors to Intel's CPUs pass through those mirrors. By 2020, Zeiss effectively holds a monopoly of EUV mirrors, and by 2025, their high-NA EUV systems will push below 8 nanometers.
I think it's so interesting. In 2024, Zeiss's semiconductor manufacturing technology, remember Zeiss is split into 4 companies. This generates a good chunk of it. It's 2.3 billion in revenue. It's a quarter of their total turnover. It's growing 20% annually. Other parts of their business are growing well. This is just growing faster. And again, I just love the fact that this company was in the kind of the glass famine years, king and queen donating their opera glasses to the, Britain in World War One. They're also involved in this leading AI race today as the people who produce the lenses for the machines, etc. It's the same company.
Yeah. And the other thing which is so remarkable is that they have become pretty much a monopoly supplier in that specific quality category. When we think about the Western Hemisphere, we think about the Western Alliance, because of course now these capabilities, regardless of what was the original reason of building them, they are part of the national security of the Western Alliance, and all of a sudden this company is in the very, very heart of it. And it doesn't. I mean, you can take any executive decision of saying that, okay, we're going to build a factory like that. I mean, you can do all kinds of executive decisions, but actually building a competing factory for what we have in the Netherlands and in Germany for this activity, I mean, it's very, very difficult to repeat that.
And look, we could go on. We could talk about Zeiss in space. We talked briefly earlier that they were a big part of the moon landings and those iconic Earthrise photos. They are literally everywhere and everything. They're in the lenses that are in satellites. Basically, if it involves seeing through something, Zeiss is there. But just to kind of bring this to a kind of close, Zeiss today, when you look at the numbers 2023, 2024, Zeiss Group posted a 10 billion in revenue. Schott is about 2.8 billion in revenue. It's accounted slightly differently. On that side, their semiconductor manufacturing business is now bringing in about 4 billion, which has grown. It's now 38% of total revenue. Their medical technology contributes 2.6 billion at 24%. Industrial quality and research brings in 2.3 billion at 22%, and consumer markets is 1.66 billion. And Marty, these numbers strike me because, one, when I look at this company, which is everywhere and doing everything in space, semiconductors, medical instruments, camera phones, I'm still surprised that the total revenue for the group is only, and everyone loves it in their back pocket, but it's only 13 billion, right? And that is not a big number in comparison to the impact that they've had on humanity and the world. What do you think about that kind of 13 billion versus everything else? We've covered companies that are much, much bigger, do less, but generate way more revenue.
Yeah, but I mean, it's of course the role that you play in the overall supply chain. And of course, I mean, if you think about system integrators, when you are building huge systems, then when you have a number of suppliers and then you are combining their efforts into one, then you get big numbers. But it's still, I think Zeiss is it's a very focused company after all. They are having very specific products rather than trying to be the masters of universe. So growth in itself is not growing at any cost is not it's not a passion for them. I mean, they want to play the role that they play, and they want to play that well. And growing just for growth's sake is not necessarily something that you need to do, because they are not after control. I mean, if they were after control, then they would start hoarding all kinds of adjacent activities or vertically integrate and grow and grow and grow. But I mean, growth is not always the right answer. Sometimes it's more important to do well what you do and be comfortable with that. And if you get this fever of growing and growing for growth's sake, on the other hand, you end up taking risks that might be very detrimental for your core competence. I mean, that's my take on this whole thing.
Yeah, and again, I'm quite struck, and it may be just a recency bias. I've recently listened to The Thinking Machine, which is very much the story of DeepMind, and really the story of one of the DeepMind founders, Demis Hassabis. And again, when you listen to that story, there's a huge parallel here, because he is a great believer in the scientific method, right? And it's all about how can effectively I scale intelligence to help humanity solve its problems. And that's probably the most worthwhile thing he can do in his life. And when DeepMind sells and Google acquires them for 400 million, right, back in the day, the reason he sells, and his investors didn't want him to sell, because 400 million sounds like a lot, but for a company of DeepMind's quality was not a lot of money. But the reason he sells is because the Google founders, Larry Page, Sergey Brin, and Eric Schmidt, chairman, CEO at the time, basically say, hey, we'll give you infinite compute, because Google can effectively scale. They have more compute than anybody else. We will pretty much leave you alone to basically be the scientific research organization. You don't need to worry about making money because we will basically make the money on the rest of the business. But you now need to basically make impact and value on the science side. Now, obviously do useful things as well. Turn your algorithms on our data centers and show us how we can be more efficient and save a huge electricity bill is one of the first things they do. But without Google's, I'm going to use the old British word, patronage, almost like a patron sponsor, DeepMind would not have taken on the AlphaFold problem of protein folding and pushed the frontier and then open sourced it, because they wouldn't have been able to. They would have had to make it a commercial product and do it. And I think in that story, modern story, Demis Hassabis recently obviously got the Nobel Prize alongside his other co-founders. I see a parallel with Zeiss, right? That they made the decisions based on, yes, scaling the business, but also pushing the frontier of science.
And the other thing that comes to my mind is that we were listing early on in this podcast, we were listing these main protagonists that were not necessarily co-founders, but they were acting like as if they were founders. If you have people who are very focused on the core competence and the core deliverables of your company, it's a different mindset than having an outsider CEO who is a serial CEO jumping from one company to another every 3 to 5 years and not understanding the foundations of the business. And I believe that of course we can say that the Germans are maybe conservative, the Dutch are maybe conservative, but I believe the fact that they have not grown more aggressively here, maybe there's a wisdom of the founding fathers here, where they understand where the limits of their reasonable growth may be. And only somebody who comes totally without the wisdom of the business itself may all of a sudden come up with an idea that, okay, we can grow tenfold, and not actually understanding what they say. So I think the manic growth that we see in some businesses, sometimes it's justified. In some other areas, there may be a hidden wisdom why manic growth is not the answer, even if that may look good in your assumed future resume.
I love that. I listened to an interview the other day with the CEO of Eli Lilly, the big pharma company in the US, and he was explaining that they've had, I think, 13 CEOs in the company's 150-year history, and that's only one more CEO than popes during that period of time.
Good Lord.
And he did caveat it that this isn't a job for life and he's not prepared to die in office. But that shows you, and all but one of those Eli Lilly CEOs was an insider that had grown up in the company, been kind of cultured and schooled in the company. Now, it can go wrong. We saw that earlier with Kodak. I just thought it was interesting that these very long companies, like, back to, Weimar, Weimar in the 1850s, 1846 to today. This is a long journey for these companies.
It is. And the other thing that I kind of want to highlight here is that one of the common threads all through this story are first of all, of course, there's listening to the customer, but also there's a very high respect toward your teammates and very high respect for the specific skills and capabilities they bring to your organization. And the fact that this is a very competence and skill appreciating organization, a storyline, I think that's the core. I mean, it's the fact that they've been able to deliver rather than just say that they will or advertise that they will, they have been able to walk the walk. And in order to do that in high tech, you need to have the skills, you need to have the technologies, and you need to have the patience to perfect your deliverables. And on the other hand, you need to have the resilience to pivot when the world outside is not going according to your plans. And that has happened to Zeiss several times all along.
I think Zeiss really, in my view, they very much deserve the title category leader. And I don't think it's hyperbole in their respect. They lead in optics, how the world sees, and they lead in measurement, how the world knows. And it's fantastic to tell the story of, and they did, I must say, tribute to Zeiss Foundation corporate. They have an excellent set of research materials that was available to us on their website, explaining their history and unpacking it for anyone to see. I would strongly recommend people have a look at this. But they very much set out a very clear scientific method-based stall and stayed at the frontier throughout their history and to today. Marty, any more final thoughts on Zeiss before we introduce our next company for next month?
Well, I mean, this has been a great story altogether. Well, one tidbit of information when we were talking about the planar design. I mean, we were actually not addressing that too much, but the first interchangeable lens that I have for my camera is actually this is built by Nikon.
Okay.
But this is essentially that 6-lens 4-group design that was the 50 millimeters f2.0 of Zeiss design. This was built by Nikon originally early 60s, but really as a testament to the stuff. This is my first lens and something that I still use today, just because of the fact that some of these capabilities are pretty much eternal. And it's been a great pleasure to go through the Zeiss story due to the fact that our paths have collided several times in the past.
Oh, I love the fact that it's in the camera, it's in the wine glasses, it's in the semiconductors that are in the computer, that are in the phone, in the car. It's everywhere, the impact on that.
Yeah, indeed.
So we have foreshadowed a little bit next month's category leader, and it's a natural continuation of the Zeiss story. We need to look at ASML. If there is one company in Europe that has strategic sovereignty written all over it and global importance, it's ASML. So we need to understand, why did Philips decide that effectively this company, this idea was too hot to handle inside in the 1980s? So, as we've said, Zeiss builds the mirrors, ASML builds probably the world's most complicated machines. The next month's podcast will be even more technical than this one. And it's ASML that powers the global chip economy. So join us next month when we will basically dive deep on the best of the Netherlands, arguably the most complicated deep tech company in Europe, ASML. Thank you for listening to Category Leaders, where Marty and I unpack based in Europe, best in the world companies. To make sure that you catch further episodes, follow us on your favorite podcasting app. Please give us a review, as it helps us immensely. Thank you.